Hey everybody, and welcome to another iOS development video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we'll continue down our path learning Swift 4 and iOS development. Make sure you watch the previous videos and subscribe to this channel to see more on all things iOS, Android, 3D modeling, game development, and everything else to arm yourself in the digital world. So let's get started. All right, the next thing I want to show you is functions and functions in Swift 4. So very similar to the way that JavaScript functions work. We just have an func instead of function in JavaScript if you're familiar. If not, don't worry about it. But func stands for function, just shorthand for function, so we don't have to type in all those characters. And then your function name, you can name this whatever you want. You can say add values or whatever the function is supposed to be doing. We'll get into how to properly name our functions going forward. But you can just basically type in whatever you want. And the parameter list that you're going to type in is, it's going to be these parentheses, and so you can put parameters inside those parentheses. So I'm just going to have a zero parameter function. And then the body of the function, where we're actually going to put our code. So if you're not familiar with functions, functions allow us to reuse a bit of code over and over and over again simply by calling that function. So what I'm going to do to show you how this works is just put in a print statement. And I'm going to type that in if I can spell it right. There we go. Okay, and it doesn't do anything. So it doesn't print out anything on the right-hand side here. It doesn't print anything to our console. But if I double click on this name to highlight the entire function name, copy that with Command C down here, Command V to paste it, and then do our empty parentheses, give it a second to recompile, and you can see that now this is being called. Okay, and now it actually has this value being printed out. Okay, so that's how we do function names, and of course I can copy that line of code and paste it 2 or 3 times, and every time I do that, we can see that this is being executed as many times as I call that line of code. So very useful stuff. So to make it even more useful, what I'm going to do is add the ability to add parameters in here to make the function a little bit more dynamic. So I'm going to create a new function. So I'm going to call this function that adds 2 strings. And we use camel case, so as you put in more words, we capitalize that second word. So function that adds 2 strings. And for the parameters, I'm going to actually just construct the rest of my function body here by putting in some curly braces. So we need 2 strings to pass in here. And this one is, we're going to call it one string, comma, 2 string. But for functions, we have to be explicit about that. So we have to tell it the type. I'm going to hit escape to get rid of that. So to tell it the type, we just, again, use the same moniker of :type as we used up here for the explicit typecasting of that variable. So all I have to do is just say, okay, that's going to be the 2 parameters that we pass in here. And once we do that, oh, it looks like it added two curly braces, so I'm going to delete the second curly brace. And up in here, if this would stop scrolling once it compiles, I'm just going to do a print statement, and I'm going to print out 1 plus space plus 2 string. Okay, that's going to compile. I'm going to I'm going to call that function. And of course, I didn't give it any values to add, so I'm just going to say 1, comma, 2. Notice there's no space in between them, but it's going to give me another error first. And I'm missing argument labels on this function call. So again, I've kind of done it in the JavaScript/Java method, but what Swift is asking for is that these need to be named. I need to explicitly say that this 1 value coordinates to this, and that this 2 value coordinates to that. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of silly, but let me show you what this looks like before we talk about it a little bit more. So I'm going to click on the stop sign with a dot in the middle, and it's going to say replace the string 1 with the name variable. So let's just go ahead and fix that, show you what it looks like. So this matches up exactly with 1, and instead of the value here, or excuse me, instead of the type here, it's the value, and 2 string is instead of that type, it's the value. And this allows us to call these functions or methods without having to actually know what goes in 1 and what goes in 2. So for example, we might have a create, let me hit escape to get rid of that, and create car, and we don't know whether the make or model goes first. This could be the make, comma, model. I don't know if they swap those back and forth, like something like this. If I cut that and paste it there, maybe the model goes first, maybe the make goes first. But if you explicitly name it, let's say model, and of course this function doesn't exist, so it's going to give me some errors, and model, well, now I know explicitly that these two values are backwards, and so I would go ahead and swap those. But that's the reason why we do that. If you don't want to do it for whatever reason, especially if there's only one parameter in here, what you can do is on that parameter you can do an underscore or an underbar. And if I type that in, it's going to actually complain because this no longer needs to be labeled. So that underbar allows me to do that, and you can see that the value of that, actually let me go ahead and just show that result, is the string 1 space 2. I want to show you something else in Swift. You might be used to doing string concatenation with like this, but I'll show you an easier way in Swift, and this has been around for pretty much the beginning of Swift. But I want to do placeholders for the string values. So normally what you would want to do, and this goes back to the fact that the most obvious way of programming should be the most optimal. And so what I would probably want to do is the value of string, sorry this is flickering around, it's compiling. So the value of string 1 space the value of string 2. But we can't do that because what's going to happen is it's just going to literally type or print out 1 string, 2 string with a space between the two. And if we expand that out, you can see what's going on here. So I want the value of those variables, not the actual name of those variables. And so the way that we do that in Swift is we surround the variable name that we want to print out inside of the string by doing a backslash and another parenthesis. So you can think about the backslash as a function call within our string, and I have to end the parenthesis as well. And so now what this is going to do is give us the value of 1, which in our case is just 1, and then space, because we have a space here. And then again, I haven't put in any, I haven't told it to print out the value of this. It's just going to print out 2 strings. So let me go ahead and do that as well. So backslash parenthesis, switch over here, end parenthesis, and again, surrounding the name of the variable inside the string. You can see that the code syntax highlighting has changed the color of that. And so now we have the value of 1 string variable and the value of 2 string variable, and that's just going to be 1 space 2. All right, let's move on. What about return values? So if you guys are familiar, not only do I just want this to print out or do something within the function, but I want that function to actually give me a value that I can use elsewhere in my application. So that's called a return value. So let's give us some space. I'm actually going to copy our delimiter there and just paste it in there, and then hit enter as we kind of scroll down here. Okay, so we're going to create a new function just like we've been doing all along, and I'm going to do one just called interest calculator. Interest calculator. Okay, and so an interest calculator is going to take a principal amount. So this is going to be called principal and amount. I think I spelled principal wrong. Can't remember if it's AL or LE, but doesn't matter. There's no spell check in this. And that's going to be an integer, and then we're going to have an interest rate. And that interest rate is going to be a float value. So it's going to be something like 1.2% or 4.2% or something like that. And the way that we want to have this function work, this interest calculator, is I'm going to take the principal value, let's say it's $100, and how much, if I make $100 and I apply an interest rate of 1% to that over the year, what's my resulting value? Well, that's going to be 101, because 1% of 100 is $1, and then you add that to the 100 to give you the final result. So I want to return that result. And the way that we do that is at the end of our method here, or our function, is we kind of create this little arrow. And the way that we do it is the hyphen and then the greater than sign. So people call these chevrons or whatever. But this whole kind of symbol is an arrow. And what's the type that we're going to return? Well, I probably shouldn't have made this an integer, or should probably make that a float, but I just wanted to demonstrate how this works. The return value is going to be a float, so let me just go ahead and do that. And then curly brace, hit enter, creates that in curly brace for us. And so we're going to take the principal amount and multiply, and we're going to do a little star there, that's shift 8 if you're not familiar, multiplied by the interest. And actually, I'm going to rename this interest rate just to be explicitly clear. Okay. Now I could print this out if I wanted to, maybe for debugging purposes, and hit enter, but, or excuse me, save it. But again, it's going to say that I can't combine an int and a float. So what I'm going to do is actually convert my principal amount to a float. Do it that way. But again, maybe it's probably better that I allow the user, or somebody who's using our, the user would be another developer in our case, but allow the developer that's using our code, if any, to allow them to enter in $100.50 or something like that. And so that would require a float value, in which case we no longer need to do that, and then get rid of the end parenthesis. So it should look something like this. I'm still getting an error because I'm missing the return value of that. So I printed it out, which is not going to show me what the printout value is yet because, well, one, I don't have the inputs set up yet for this. I'd have to call that down here. But I don't have a return value. So if we enter and we just say return, and I can also return this value, just highlighting it, copying, pasting it, I can do that as well. And so the value of this becomes a float, which is returned here. But probably something a little bit better would be creating a new variable for this, and something called new principal. And that way, if I change how this works here, then I don't have to change it down here as well. So I'm just going to type in new p, hit enter, and that'll allow us to do the computation. It'll compute this value and then return it. So we can simply do it as we've always done with our functions. Paste that in, give it a value, let's say 100, and then a comma, and let's say we want an interest rate of, I don't know, let's say 4.5, and so that should give us 104.5 or $104.50. But again, I'm missing those labels, so if you forget that, if you come from other languages, just click on the little stop sign there and just fix it. It'll automatically do that for you. Okay, so once we do that, we can see that the value is not 104.50 because we didn't really calculate this properly. And so that's what I was mentioning. If we change the value of this, that's kind of why I was showing you this. What I would do is change the value here, so then I didn't have to change the return value. So you never want to duplicate code. So all we really need to do is just divide that interest rate, that 4.5, by 100 to actually give me 0.045 instead of 4.5. And now the value is 4.5. Now I mentioned that this is going to be added to the principal. So in other words, if we do 100, and let me write this down so you can see what I'm saying, 100 plus the $4.50 that I wanted. Let me make this into a comment because this is kind of explaining my code. So $100 plus the $4.50 in interest, that should equal 104.50. All right, so why am I explicitly spelling this out? Because again, comments are really good to kind of document your code of what it should be doing. And actually, maybe I would put this. It keeps flickering. Sorry about that. Cut that out, paste it up there. All right, so once we have that all set up, what it's returning instead, and this is why this is very useful, Playgrounds is very useful for Swift programming, because if you're trying to test out a new algorithm, you can throw it into a playground and then test out to see if the values that you're putting in is what you think is getting out. And in our case, it's not exactly. And so what I can do is I can just go ahead and say, let's actually put this into a variable. It's just, it's going to be the initial principal. It's going to equal 100. And I'll also make the interest rate also a variable, constant value. Okay, and then instead of passing in hard-coded values, I'm going to paste in these. Okay, and it's okay that this has the same name as that. Oh, and okay, so what I've done is, since this was a 100 and it's going to think that this is an integer, and so it's going to say I can't convert an int, which is what I'm trying to pass in here, to this first parameter as a float. So I could cast that into a float like that, and that'll get rid of our error once I add the other one. And it's going to also say that the this is a double and it's expecting a float, yada yada. So instead of having to do that, what I'm just going to do is, since this is a float, let's also capture that colon, copy that, paste that down there and down there to make our initial principal and our interest rate both floats, so that those work. And again, Swift is a strongly typed language, so you cannot even get away with converting or combining or doing any kind of operation on an integer and a float, or a float and a double, etc., etc. So that's how to fix most of those problems that you may run into. Okay, so this interest calculator is actually getting it's returning a value of 4.5, but I want to add that to the initial value of 100. So I'm calculating the interest calculator. This is how much interest I'm making. So the interest principal plus, which is $100 here, remember that, plus, so there's that plus there, 450, which is the return value of this entire statement here. Hopefully that's going to equal 104.5, and that's exactly what that does. But let's say I want to append a $sign to that. Well, again, we just do like a $sign here as a double quote, and then add that to this. But it won't allow me to add the string to all these different things. So what I can do is combine all these, that whole statement, this whole thing. Once it's done calculating what's inside here, it'll come back as a float value, and then I'm passing that float value into a string constructor, and then it's giving me that final string of $104.50 there. So pretty complex stuff that we can accomplish just with what I just went over. All right, so I'm going to show you one more thing before we jump into classes, but this value here, if we just kind of put this value in line here, and maybe I would even wrap this in a print statement so we can see it on our console down at the bottom here once this is done. Okay, there it is, 405. I'm going to add in our delimiter there. Okay, so what I wanted to show you is, what if this changes a whole bunch of times? If we're doing a whole bunch of calculations, such as compounded monthly or daily interest rate, and so this value would change quite a bit. Let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to create a new function, and this one's just going to be called Exponential Growth. Okay, and it's going to take in two values, it's going to take in one value, which is the... Okay, so I'm going to call it exponential growth, and for this one I'm just going to have one value, so I'm just going to say with rate. And the reason I do this is, I'm going to make this a float value, is I want to be able to read this as a sentence. So exponential growth with rate, and then whatever that value is. And it's not going to have a return value in our case, but I just wanted to show how you can debug functions using Playgrounds for different algorithms that you may come up with. So I'm going to create a new, it's going to be a variable because I'm going to change it over time. And I'm going to say that this is just value, and it is also a float value. And I'm going to start that with the value of 1. All right, so the thing I want to do is I'm going to take this 1 value and I'm going to multiply it many, many times to this value as well, so that hopefully it grows over time. And this is kind of simulating exponential interest rates or just compound interest. So for a loop in Swift, and again this keeps scrolling down, my apologies, I'm going to say while something is true. Actually, if we go back and I hit Control Space to bring up my autocomplete, you can see that this is one of the options of the autocomplete is the while Swift while statement. Hit enter on that. We're just going to ask for a condition, and I'm going to say, in order to avoid an infinite loop, I'm going to say value is less than 100. Okay, so while this condition is true, while value is less than 100, we could either click in the code, or again we use our control / to jump to that placeholder. I'm going to say value is now, and remember our shorthand for creating, sorry about the jumping code. I'm going to say I want to value multiplied by itself times the rate, and so we can do multiply equals and then the with rate here. Okay, and so what this is going to do is it's going to take in an initial rate and again multiply it a couple times until that rate equals 100. So I'm going to copy this, paste it down here. And so it's going to autocomplete that with rate. So what's the rate going to be? Well, let's say it's 1.2. That's all we have to do. Okay, and so it's going to say for this line, line 67 in our case, that we have this value printed out. This line is executed 26 times. Okay, so it's going to start with an initial value of 1, and then it's going to multiply it by 1.2, and then it's going to take that return value of that and apply it back to the value, so it's going to be 1.2, and then you're going to take 1.2, then multiply it by 1.2, and so on and so forth. Well, if I had a return value of that, so after the loop is done, we say return value, and then make this have a return value of, it's a float. Now we can see that the, oops, if it stops scrolling on me, we can see that the final version of that is 114.47. But maybe you're, again, interested in the intermediate values of this for loop, or this while loop as it goes through here. Because if I change the value of 1.2, maybe I'm trying to get an optimal value. If I change that to 1.4, instead of executing 26 times, scroll down again, it's going to execute 14 times. Oh, well, that's interesting, but I have no insight into how that looks. But if you hit the show value button here, or show result, you'll see that now it's showing as a graph over time. So as the value changes for each iteration of that while loop, you can see that it's showing an exponential growth curve. And as I increase the value of this rate, it's going to execute fewer times. In this case, it executes 8 times. And then you can see the how that growth goes up a little bit. So I think this is a good place to stop. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in this series on Swift 4 and iOS development. In our next video, we'll talk about classes, which you'll be using in all of your applications going forward. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.